Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we explore one of Boston's most notorious criminal organizations, a group whose operations of extortion, racketeering, and murder left a lasting scar on the city's history. This is the story of the Winter Hill Gang. A tale of ambition, betrayal, and cold-blooded brutality. This case will leave you wondering, what happens when loyalty to the mob clashes with survival instincts? And how far will someone go to ensure their secrets remain buried? Stay with us as we unravel the chilling rise and fall of the Winter Hill Gang. Buddy McKenna and Tommy Russo were names that commanded fear and respect in Boston's underworld. One ruled the city with an iron fist, building an empire of crime that seemed untouchable. The other was his trusted enforcer, a man who knew all the gang's secrets and carried out its darkest deeds. But when loyalty turned to betrayal, their bond shattered, setting off a chain of events that would destroy the Winter Hill Gang and bring Boston's most feared crime boss to his knees. What drove one man to betray the other? And how far would the other go to reclaim his power? This is the story of betrayal, vengeance, and the fall of a criminal empire. The story begins in the shadowy streets of Somerville, Massachusetts, in the 1950s, a city straddling the line between industrial ambition and criminal opportunity. At the heart of this environment was James "Buddy" McKenna, a streetwise hustler with a magnetic personality and an unrelenting drive for power. Buddy had a knack for organization and a reputation for ruthlessness that set him apart from the petty criminals that roamed Boston's neighborhoods. Charismatic yet cold, he understood how to turn the chaos around him into an empire. Buddy's ascent began in local gambling circles, running small-time operations that gradually grew into a sophisticated network of betting dens. His efficiency caught the attention of bigger players in Boston's criminal underworld, but while they saw a useful ally, Buddy saw an opportunity to outpace them. To achieve his vision, he needed loyal partners, ones who shared his hunger for dominance but were willing to follow his lead. One such figure was Danny the Hammer O'Leary, a childhood friend turned trusted enforcer. Danny had the physicality and brutality to enforce Buddy's will on the streets. With Danny by his side, Buddy began targeting the city's more lucrative operations, such as loan sharking and smuggling. However, his ambition went beyond financial gains. He wanted control over rival gangs, over Somerville, and eventually over Boston itself. Buddy's defining moment came in the early 1960s when he decided to break away from established crime families and form his own faction. The group, later named the Winter Hill Gang after the Somerville neighborhood which they called home, where they operated, would become one of Boston's most notorious criminal organizations. It wasn't an easy transition. Breaking free from the old guard required precise planning and calculated violence. Rivals who resisted Buddy's vision quickly disappeared, often under mysterious circumstances. Their fate sent a clear message: defy the Winter Hill Gang at your peril. Under Buddy's leadership, the gang established a grip on illegal gambling, loan sharking, and smuggling operations, outsmarting rivals and dodging law enforcement. But their real power came from an unexpected source: an alliance with local politicians and a few corrupt cops who turned a blind eye in exchange for kickbacks. The gang's rapid rise was fueled by its ability to adapt. Buddy, always several steps ahead, saw the potential in forming alliances with key figures outside the criminal world. Corrupt politicians and police officers became silent partners, turning a blind eye to the gang's activities in exchange for regular payouts. This network of protection allowed the Winter Hill Gang to expand its reach without the constant threat of law enforcement interference. By the mid-1960s, the Winter Hill Gang controlled much of Boston's underground economy. They monopolized illegal gambling, dominated smuggling routes, and ran an extensive loan sharking operation that preyed on the vulnerable and desperate. Their influence wasn't confined to Boston. The gang established connections that reached across New England, solidifying their reputation as a force to be reckoned with. Despite their success, the gang operated under constant tension. Buddy's leadership style demanded absolute loyalty, but his paranoia began to grow as whispers of discontent and rivalries emerged within the group. The gang's brutality, while effective in consolidating power, created a long list of enemies. Old crime families plotted revenge, and smaller gangs sought to undermine the Winter Hill Gang's dominance. In one particularly gruesome display of power, a rival gang member who refused to pay tribute was found lifeless on the docks of Boston Harbor. This wasn't just a murder, it was a statement. The Winter Hill Gang didn't just punish dissent, they annihilated it. Stories like these only added to Buddy's legend, but they also drew attention from the authorities, who were beginning to take a closer look at the Winter Hill Gang's operations. Buddy's inner circle was another source of potential danger. While Danny O'Leary remained fiercely loyal, other members of the gang were less reliable. As Buddy's empire grew, so did the stakes, and not everyone could handle the pressure. Distrust began to fester, threatening the foundation of the gang. Still, Buddy remained confident in his ability to control his men and outsmart anyone who dared challenge him. By the late 1960s, the Winter Hill Gang had reached the height of its power. From their stronghold in Somerville, they ruled Boston's criminal underworld with an iron grip. But with success came new enemies, both inside and outside the gang. Rival organizations that had been subdued by Buddy's early aggression were regrouping, seeking opportunities to strike back. Meanwhile, whispers of betrayal began circulating within the Winter Hill Gang itself. For all of Buddy's brilliance and brutality, his enemies were growing bolder, and his allies less trustworthy. As cracks started to form in the seemingly impenetrable empire he had built, the stage was set for a series of events that would ultimately unravel everything. The Winter Hill Gang had risen to the top of Boston's criminal hierarchy, but the higher the climb, the greater the fall. As the Winter Hill Gang grew in power, its success brought not only wealth and influence but also unforeseen risks. By the early 1970s, the gang's dominance over Boston's underground economy was undeniable. Illegal gambling, smuggling, and loan sharking flourished under their control. But with expansion came the need for new recruitsmen who could handle the growing demands of the operation. This need led Buddy McKenna to bring in a promising young hustler named Tommy Russo. Tommy was ambitious and resourceful, qualities that made him stand out to Buddy. He had built a reputation in South Boston as a clever operator with connections in the narcotics trade, a network that promised high profits. Despite Buddy's strict policy against drug trafficking, Tommy's potential was too good to ignore. For Buddy, it was a calculated risk. For Tommy, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Danny O'Leary, however, wasn't as convinced. He saw Tommy's charm as a veneer masking a dangerous ambition, and the young recruit's eagerness unsettled him. Danny had spent years at Buddy's side, ensuring the gang's operations ran smoothly and efficiently. He valued loyalty above all else, and Tommy didn't inspire trust. Buddy's decision to incorporate Tommy's drug connections into the gang's portfolio brought immediate returns. The cash flow from the narcotics trade was staggering, surpassing the earnings from gambling and smuggling combined. But with this influx of wealth came new challenges. The narcotics business attracted a different kind of scrutiny, not just from rivals but from law enforcement. Federal agents were increasingly cracking down on drug rings, and whispers of an FBI task force investigating organized crime in Boston began to circulate. Tommy, for all his cunning, had secrets of his own. Unknown to Buddy or Danny, he was already working with the FBI. Faced with mounting pressure from previous criminal charges, Tommy had made a deal to act as an informant. To the feds, he was the key to bringing down the Winter Hill Gang. To Tommy, it was a chance to protect himself while playing both sides. It was a dangerous game, one that required him to carefully navigate the gang's suspicions while feeding just enough information to his handlers to keep them satisfied. Tensions within the gang began to rise as Tommy's influence grew. His narcotics operations, though lucrative, brought chaos. A botched drug deal in Charlestown led to the murder of a rival gang member, sparking a violent turf war. The escalation of violence drew media attention and brought the Winter Hill Gang into the spotlight. For Buddy, the stakes had never been higher. He relied on Tommy's network to maintain the gang's revenue streams, but the disruption it caused began to strain the delicate balance of power within the organization. Danny O'Leary, ever watchful, became increasingly vocal about his concerns. He suspected that Tommy's quick rise was more than a matter of ambition. Strange patterns began to emerge: missed shipments, raids that seemed too perfectly timed, and a growing tension in Tommy's demeanor. Danny was no fool. He'd seen betrayal before, and the signs were all there. But proving it was another matter entirely. Without evidence, he risked alienating Buddy by making accusations against someone who had become central to their operations. Tommy, meanwhile, played his role with precision. He fed the FBI just enough information to keep his handlers satisfied while protecting himself from suspicion within the gang. The agents he worked with were careful not to act too aggressively, knowing that tipping their hand too soon could cost them their informant. The delicate dance continued, with Tommy walking a razor's edge between survival and exposure. As the gang dealt with the fallout of the escalating turf war, Buddy's paranoia deepened. He began to suspect that someone within the organization was leaking information. Raids on their gambling dens and smuggling routes had become more frequent, and federal agents seemed to know more than they should. To Buddy, it was a betrayal of the highest order. He ordered internal investigations, leaning on Danny to uncover the truth. Danny, now certain that Tommy was the source of their troubles, began quietly gathering evidence. The gang's internal turmoil only worsened when another shipment went missing under suspicious circumstances. Buddy, furious and desperate for answers, intensified his scrutiny. The pressure within the Winter Hill gang reached a boiling point. Tommy's double life became harder to maintain, as Danny's shadow loomed closer with every misstep. Yet Tommy was cunning, and he managed to stay one step ahead, spinning plausible explanations for the mounting suspicions against him. For the FBI, the walls were beginning to close in on the Winter Hill gang. With Tommy's intel, they had mapped out much of the gang's operations, and plans were in motion to take them down. The agents knew they were walking a fine line. If Tommy's cover was blown, the entire operation could fall apart, and he'd be lucky to escape with his life. As the pieces moved into place, the gang's once unshakable foundation began to crack. Buddy's reliance on loyalty was no longer enough to hold everything together. Danny's instincts told him that time was running out to expose Tommy. But he also knew that confronting Buddy with his suspicions would require proof. The mistrust within the Winter Hill gang grew, creating rifts that could not be repaired. The tension reached a peak when Buddy devised a test to confirm his suspicions about a potential mole. He orchestrated a seemingly routine smuggling operation, one designed to lure out the traitor. Unbeknownst to Tommy, Buddy and Danny were watching from the shadows, ready to act on any sign of betrayal. Tommy, unaware of the trap, moved forward with the operation as planned. For the first time, his carefully constructed facade on the verge of collapse. The fate of the Winter Hill gang now hung in the balance, teetering between survival and destruction. The Winter Hill gang, in the early 1970s, was at its peak, but the foundations were crumbling. Once a force to be reckoned with, was beginning to crack under the weight of betrayal and suspicion. Danny O'Leary discovered discrepancies in the gang's financial records, and Buddy McKenna, who had built the empire from the ground up, now found himself surrounded by uncertainty. The paranoia that had been simmering for months was about to boil over, and the target of their suspicions was the young recruit Tommy Russo. For all his charm and profitability, Tommy's rise had brought chaos. Now, with federal agents closing in and rivals emboldened, Buddy decided it was time to act. The operation unfolded under a tense atmosphere. Tommy handled the logistics with his usual confidence, unaware that his every move was being watched. At first, everything seemed to go smoothly. The goods were loaded, and the convoy began its journey. But just as the shipment reached its halfway point, federal agents swarmed in, intercepting the vehicles and seizing the cargo. The timing was too perfect, too precise. For Buddy, there was no longer any doubt Tommy had betrayed them. Buddy's fury was immediate and consuming. But eliminating Tommy wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. The federal agents had taken him into custody, shielding him from the gang's wrath. Worse, the raid confirmed that law enforcement had deep knowledge of the Winter Hill Gang's operations. The breadth of the information suggested that Tommy hadn't just betrayed them in this one instance, he had been working against them for months, feeding critical details to the FBI. With Tommy in federal hands, Buddy turned his focus inward. The betrayal had left the gang vulnerable, and every action now carried the weight of desperation. The FBI's next moves were unpredictable, but Buddy knew they wouldn't stop with the smuggling ring. They had likely built a much larger case, and it was only a matter of time before more arrests followed. To counter this, Buddy ordered a complete reorganization of the gang's structure, cutting off loose ends and eliminating anyone he deemed unreliable. It was a brutal and rapid purge that only deepened the fractures within the organization. Danny, still reeling from the betrayal, took on the task of damage control. While Buddy plotted their survival, Danny sought to uncover just how much Tommy had revealed to the authorities. The pieces began to fall into place. The seemingly random raids on their gambling dens, the early accurate disruptions of their smuggling routes, and the increasing presence of law enforcement near their operations. Tommy had been playing a long game, positioning himself to dismantle the Winter Hill Gang from within while keeping himself out of harm's way. The betrayal hit harder than any rival attack ever could. Buddy had always relied on loyalty as the cornerstone of his empire, and Tommy's actions shattered that belief. It wasn't just the operational setbacks or the financial losses. It was the humiliation of having been outsmarted by someone he had trusted enough to bring into the inner circle. For a man like Buddy, this kind of defeat was intolerable. As the FBI tightened its grip, the gang's remaining members grew increasingly restless. Whispers of more moles began circulating, fueled by the uncertainty and fear that now plagued the organization. Buddy's paranoia, once a tool that kept him sharp, became a liability. He trusted fewer and fewer people, isolating himself as he tried to salvage what was left of his crumbling empire. Meanwhile, the federal investigation accelerated. With Tommy as their star witness, the FBI began filing indictments against key members of the Winter Hill Gang. The case they had built was formidable, relying not only on Tommy's testimony but also on evidence gathered during months of surveillance and raids. The gang's once impenetrable facades falling apart, and every arrest brought them closer to Buddy himself. For Buddy, the walls were closing in. He moved between safe houses, constantly changing locations to evade capture. His once orderly empire was now a chaotic scramble for survival. Trusted lieutenants either disappeared or turned themselves in, hoping to strike deals with the authorities before it was too late. Danny, still loyal to Buddy, tried to maintain some semblance of order, but even he couldn't ignore the writing on the wall. The FBI's efforts culminated in a sweeping raid across Boston, targeting the gang's remaining strongholds. Dozens of members were arrested, and the scale of the operation sent shockwaves through the city. Buddy, however, remained elusive. Despite the FBI's best efforts, he managed to stay one step ahead, using the same cunning that had once made him a formidable leader. But even as Buddy evaded capture, his options dwindled. The betrayal had left the Winter Hill Gang irreparably damaged. Their financial reserves were depleted, their operations dismantled, and their reputation shattered. For Buddy, the question was no longer how to rebuild, but how long he could stay free. In the aftermath of the raid, the true extent of Tommy's betrayal became clear. He hadn't just exposed the gang's operations, he had provided the FBI with the names, locations, inner workings of their entire network, and even Buddy's personal hideouts. The case was airtight. And the government wasn't just aiming for the foot soldiers. They wanted Buddy McKenna, the man who had ruled Boston's underworld for decades. As Buddy watched his empire crumble from the shadows, he began to realize the inevitability of his downfall. The betrayal he had worked so hard to prevent had come from within, and there was no undoing the damage. The Winter Hill Gang, once the pinnacle of organized crime in Boston, was now a fractured shell of its former self. And Buddy, for all his brilliance and ruthlessness, was facing the one enemy he couldn't defeat: time. As the Winter Hill Gang unraveled, Buddy McKenna's once mighty empire descended into chaos. The FBI's relentless pursuit had dismantled the gang's operations piece by piece, leaving Buddy a fugitive. From the safety of hidden locations, he watched as his loyalists were arrested, his territories seized, and his influence evaporated. For a man who had built his life around control, the loss of power was both humiliating and enraging. Yet, even in hiding, Buddy's mind was still calculating, still searching for a way to regain some semblance of control. Tommy Russo, the man who had orchestrated the betrayal, now found himself in a precarious position. As the star witness for the FBI, he was both an asset and a liability. The agents protected him fiercely, knowing his testimony was the key to dismantling the Winter Hill Gang completely. But the very fact that Tommy had turned informant made him a target. Word spread quickly in the Underworld, and Buddy's remaining loyalists vowed revenge. The betrayal wasn't just a matter of business, it was personal. For Buddy, Tommy wasn't just a traitor, he was the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong. Buddy's paranoia, sharpened by years of dealing with rivals and betrayal, drove him to take calculated risks even while on the run. He knew that the FBI would eventually close in on him, but he also knew they wouldn't stop until Tommy's testimony was complete. Buddy's survival now hinged on silencing Tommy before he could deliver the final blow. It wasn't just about self-preservation, it was about reclaiming his legacy. The FBI, anticipating retaliation, relocated Tommy to a safe house under constant surveillance. The location was a fortress of precautions. Security teams rotated shifts, surveillance systems monitored every angle, and every visitor was screened thoroughly. But Buddy had connections that reached further than most expected. While many of his associates had been arrested or turned against him, a few loyal operatives remained in the shadows, willing to risk everything for their former leader. With their help, Buddy began piecing together Tommy's location. At the same time, the arrests came in waves, decimating the gang's hierarchy. Danny O'Leary, the enforcer who had once been Buddy's most loyal ally, found himself in the crosshairs of a plea deal. Facing decades in prison, Danny O'Leary wrestled with his own sense of loyalty. He had stood by Buddy for decades, enforcing his vision and protecting the gang's interests. But now, with the empire in ruins, Danny questioned whether there was anything left to fight for. The relentless pursuit by law enforcement had left Danny exhausted, and he knew that aligning himself with Buddy's increasingly desperate plans would only lead to one outcome: destruction. Yet, despite his doubts, Danny couldn't walk away. Loyalty was ingrained in him, and abandoning Buddy, even in the face of inevitable defeat, felt impossible. Buddy's plan to eliminate Tommy unfolded with precision. Using his remaining resources, he tracked the movements of federal agents, studied their routines, and identified weaknesses in their security. The plan was simple in concept but dangerous in execution. Buddy intended to strike when Tommy was most vulnerable, during one of the rare moments he was transported between safe houses. It was a high-stakes gamble, but it was the only option Buddy saw to salvage what little control he had left. The FBI, despite its precautions, faced its own challenges. Protecting an informant as volatile as Tommy was a logistical nightmare. His criminal past made him difficult to manage, and his demands for safety often clashed with the agent's protocols. As the trial date approached, the pressure on both sides intensified. Tommy's testimony was critical, not only to convicting Buddy, but also to dismantling what remained of the Winter Hill Gang. For the FBI, failure wasn't an option. On the night of the planned ambush, tensions reached their peak. Buddy and his remaining loyalists positioned themselves along the transport route, waiting for the convoy to emerge. The streets were quiet, shrouded in an eerie calm that belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. Buddy's mind raced with thoughts of revenge and redemption, his hands gripping a weapon he hadn't used in years. For all his planning, this moment felt more personal than strategic. It wasn't just about silencing Tommy, it was about reclaiming the power that had been stolen from him. As the convoy approached, Buddy's team moved into action. They created a diversion, forcing the transport vehicles to reroute into a less secure area. The maneuver worked, and for the first time in months, Buddy felt a flicker of triumph. But the FBI had anticipated such a move. Agents stationed in unmarked vehicles responded immediately, cutting off Buddy's escape routes and surrounding his team. The ambush became a chaotic standoff, with gunfire echoing through the streets. In the chaos, Tommy was whisked away to safety, his transport diverted to an undisclosed location. Buddy's attempt to silence him had failed, and with it, any hope of regaining control. The standoff ended with the capture of several of Buddy's loyalists, leaving him more isolated than ever. Injured and cornered, Buddy managed to escape into the shadows once again, but it was clear that his time was running out. The failed ambush marked a turning point. For the FBI, it was a victory that solidified their case against Buddy and the Winter Hill Gang. For Buddy, it was a devastating blow that stripped him of his remaining allies and resources. The once mighty king of Boston's underworld was now a fugitive with nothing left to lose. As he retreated deeper into hiding, Buddy began to realize the inevitability of his downfall. The empire he had built was gone, and the betrayal that had started it all was now complete. The failed ambush on Tommy Russo marked the beginning of the end for Buddy McKenna. For decades, he had ruled Boston's criminal underworld with cunning, ruthlessness, and an iron grip. Now, he was a shadow of the man he once was, a fugitive, cut off from his empire, and hunted relentlessly by law enforcement. Injured and isolated, Buddy moved from one hiding place to another, relying on dwindling favors and the few allies who remained loyal. But even those loyalties were beginning to fray under the weight of inevitable collapse. For the FBI, the ambush was a pivotal moment. It proved that Buddy was still active and determined, but it also highlighted his desperation. With Tommy Russo alive and his testimony secured, the federal case against Buddy and the remnants of the Winter Hill Gang gained unstoppable momentum. Indictments were prepared and courtrooms buzzed with the anticipation of the trial that would expose the dark heart of Boston's organized crime. The media followed every development, painting Buddy as a larger-than-life figure, whose downfall was as dramatic as his rise. Tommy, now under even tighter security, remained the star witness. His testimony would provide the critical details needed to dismantle the Winter Hill Gang's operations and convict its key players. But Tommy was far from safe. Word of his betrayal had spread throughout Boston's criminal circles, and contracts were placed on his life by those still loyal to Buddy. For the FBI, keeping him alive until the trial became their top priority. Each day was a battle against the constant threat of retaliation. Buddy, meanwhile, refused to surrender. Despite the odds stacked against him, he clung to the hope of survival. He had spent his life navigating impossible situations, outsmarting rivals, and evading the law. This time, however, the walls were closing in faster than he could escape them. His injuries from the ambush slowed him down, and his once formidable network of allies was all but gone. Former allies, desperate to save themselves, began cooperating with the authorities. Those who hadn't been arrested were lying low, unwilling to risk their own freedom for a leader who seemed doomed. Each betrayal cutting deeper than the last. Desperation drove Buddy to take risks he would have avoided in his prime. He reached out to old associates, people he hadn't contacted in years, hoping to secure resources or safe passage out of Boston. But the landscape had changed. Many of his former allies had either turned informant, been arrested, or severed ties entirely. The criminal underworld was no longer his to command. Each failed attempt to regroup deepened his sense of isolation. The FBI, relentless in their pursuit, closed in on Buddy's location with every passing day. Agents scoured his known hideouts, tracked his remaining contacts, and monitored whispers on the street. Buddy, aware that his movements were being watched, became increasingly paranoid. He avoided his usual haunts, abandoned his known aliases, and relied on disguises to evade detection. But no matter how careful he was, the net was tightening. As the trial loomed, Tommy Russo's testimony painted a damning picture of Buddy's empire. He detailed the inner workings of the Winter Hill Gang, from its smuggling routes to its gambling operations and its brutal enforcement tactics. Tommy spared no detail, recounting the gang's rise to power and Buddy's role as its mastermind. For the jury, the testimony was compelling and irrefutable. Combined with evidence gathered from raids, surveillance, and financial records, the case against Buddy was airtight. Danny's decision became the ultimate blow. After weeks of deliberation, he agreed to testify against Buddy in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony was a bombshell, detailing years of organized crime, political corruption, and murders ordered by Buddy. Buddy's final days of freedom were marked by a growing sense of inevitability. He made one last attempt to flee the city, arranging a secret meeting with an old smuggler who had once worked for him. But the FBI was already one step ahead. The smuggler, pressured by law enforcement, had turned informant. The meeting was a setup, and Buddy walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. As federal agents surrounded him, Buddy made a desperate attempt to escape, but his injuries and exhaustion left him at a disadvantage. He was apprehended without further incident. The fight finally drained from him. For the FBI, it was the culmination of years of effort. For Buddy, it was the end of an era. The trial proceeded as expected, with Tommy's and Danny's testimony, and the mountain of evidence leading to swift convictions for the remaining members of the Winter Hill Gang. Buddy, facing charges ranging from racketeering to conspiracy to commit murder, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, he maintained his composure, refusing to show any sign of defeat. But the reality of his situation was undeniable. The king of Boston's underworld had fallen, and there was no coming back. Buddy, once untouchable, now sat shackled in a courtroom as his empire crumbled around him. In the aftermath, the Winter Hill Gang was officially dismantled by the late 1970s, but its legacy lingered. Its remaining members either turned informant, fled the city, or were imprisoned. The criminal empire that had ruled Boston for decades was reduced to a cautionary tale, a reminder of the price of betrayal and the relentless pursuit of justice. Buddy McKenna was convicted on multiple counts of racketeering, conspiracy, and murder, earning him a life sentence without parole. Tommy Russo, under witness protection, disappeared into obscurity. For him, survival came at the cost of a life lived in constant fear. Danny O'Leary, now a free man, struggled to adjust to life outside the mob. His decision to betray Buddy haunted him, and he lived in constant fear of retribution. But the story didn't end there. Decades later, rumors of a hidden fortune surfaced, money allegedly stashed by Buddy before his arrest. Treasure hunters and amateur sleuths scoured Boston, hoping to uncover the gang's secret riches. Buddy McKenna's story became the stuff of legend, a tale of power, loyalty, and ultimate downfall. His rise had been meteoric, his control absolute. But his empire was brought down by the one thing he couldn't foresee: betrayal from within. For the people of Boston, the end of the Winter Hill Gang marked a turning point, a chance to reclaim a city long overshadowed by organized crime. But for those who had lived through it, the story of Buddy McKenna remained a chilling reminder of how quickly power could crumble, and how even the mightiest empires could be undone by the cracks within. But for Boston, the scars of the Winter Hill Gang's reign remained visible. The case became a cautionary tale of how unchecked ambition and betrayal could destroy even the most formidable empires. And for those who lived it, the memories of bloodshed, betrayal, and shattered loyalty lingered like a dark shadow over the city. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of Boston's criminal underworld. The story of the Winter Hill Gang reminds us that power built on fear and betrayal is doomed to crumble, leaving behind a legacy of destruction. If you found this story captivating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more true crime documentaries. This has been Mystery Minds, and as always, stay curious and stay safe.